The scream tore through the silence of the early morning. "Stop thief! Stop thief!" Tommy ran as if his life depended on it, and in many ways, it did. His bare feet pounded against the cold asphalt as he darted through dark alleys, his heart hammering in his chest. In his right hand, he clutched an old piece of bread he had just snatched from a bakery's dumpster. At 12 years old, stealing food from the trash was his only way to survive. When he finally managed to shake off the furious baker, Tommy sought refuge in his usual hiding spot, a narrow gap between two commercial buildings downtown. There, trembling from the cold and the rush of adrenaline, he divided the bread into two pieces. One for now and the other for later. This had been his reality ever since he lost his mother to cancer 2 years ago. Every meal could be his last for a while. The sky began to lighten over the city, bringing with it the familiar sounds of the metropolis waking up. Executives in their expensive suits emerged from subway stations like disciplined ants, carrying leather briefcases and steaming cups of coffee. Tommy watched them with a mix of fascination and bitterness. To him, they were like inhabitants of another planet, a world of glass and steel to which he would never belong. "Hey kid," a security guard yelled from afar. "Get out of here. This isn't a place for beggars." Tommy was used to that kind of treatment. Without making a fuss, he gathered his small sack of belongings and began to walk away, keeping his head down. That's when something extraordinary happened. A metallic sound, almost musical, caught his attention. Turning around, his eyes caught a golden glint rolling down the sidewalk. It was a wristwatch, but not just any watch. Even with his limited experience, Tommy could tell that this item was worth more than anything he had ever owned in his life. With quick and discreet movements, honed from years of living on the streets, Tommy picked up the watch before anyone else noticed. His hands trembled as he examined the piece. It was heavy, made of solid gold, with intricate details that told stories of generations. The face was protected by a perfectly clear crystal, and the golden hands moved with hypnotic precision. Turning the watch over, Tommy found an engraving on the back. "To Richard Walker, may time always be our ally. With love, Elizabeth." Below it was a more recent inscription. "Alexander Walker, CEO Walker Industries." Tommy's heart raced. Walker Industries owned half the skyscrapers in the city. Their headquarters was just a few blocks away, an imposing mirrored glass tower that seemed to touch the clouds. Tommy knew the building well. Sometimes he earned a few coins holding the door open for the executives coming and going. For a moment, dark thoughts crossed his mind. That watch could be his ticket to a better life. There was a fence in the neighboring district who bought valuable items without asking questions. With the money, Tommy could rent a room, buy new clothes, maybe even go back to school. But then his mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Tommy, our character is the one thing no one can take from us. No matter how hard life gets, always do the right thing." It was the last lesson she had given him, lying on that hospital bed, her cold hands holding his. With renewed determination, Tommy slipped the watch into the pocket of his hoodie and began walking toward Walker Industries. Each step was a battle between his survival instincts and his conscience. The security guard at the entrance eyed him suspiciously as he approached. "Please," Tommy said, his voice steadier than he felt, "I need to speak with Mr. Walker." "It's important?" "Sure, kid," the guard scoffed. "And I need to talk to the president." "It's about his watch," Tommy insisted, resisting the urge to reveal the item then and there. His street smarts warned him it was dangerous to display something so valuable in front of strangers. Something in his expression must have struck a chord with the guard, who, after a moment of hesitation, made a call. Minutes later, to Tommy's astonishment, he was escorted to the executive elevator. Alexander Walker's office occupied the entire top floor of the building. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city, making Tommy feel even smaller than he already was. Walker was a tall man in his 50s, with graying hair at his temples and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through a person. "So," Walker began, his deep voice filling the room, "you said you have something that belongs to me?" Tommy swallowed hard, summoning all his courage. Carefully, he pulled the watch from his pocket and placed it on the immaculate mahogany desk. Walker's expression changed instantly. His once cold and calculating eyes filled with an emotion Tommy couldn't quite decipher. Where did you find this?" Walker asked, his voice trembling slightly as he picked up the watch with reverence. "On the sidewalk, sir, a few blocks from here. I read the inscription and—" "This watch," Walker interrupted, "belonged to my father. It was a gift from my mother shortly before she passed. He wore it every day until he left us too." His eyes met Tommy's. "Why did you return it? You must have realized how much it's worth." Tommy paused before answering. My mom always said our character is the one thing no one can take from us. She's been gone for 2 years, but I try to live the way she taught me." The silence that followed was deafening. Walker studied Tommy with a different gaze now, as if truly seeing him for the first time. He noticed the tattered clothes, the worn-out shoes, but above all, he saw the dignity in the boy's demeanor despite everything. "Where do you live, Tommy?" The boy averted his eyes, feeling his face flush. I get by, sir." "And your parents?" "It was just my mom. Tommy swallowed the lump forming in his throat. "Cancer." Walker rose from his chair and walked to the window. For a few minutes he stood there, gazing at the city sprawling below, his father's watch clasped tightly in his hands. When he turned around, a firm resolve gleamed in his eyes. "Tommy, would you like to work for me?" Tommy stared at Alexander Walker with a mixture of fear and hope. The job offer hung in the air like an impossible dream, one he had learned not to believe in while living on the streets. His dirty hands nervously gripped the hem of his worn-out hoodie. "It's not charity," Walker clarified as if reading the boy's thoughts. "I saw something in you today that's rare even among adults: integrity. That's exactly what our company needs." He paused, studying the boy closely. "But first, we need to take care of a few things." The next few hours were a whirlwind for Tommy. Walker summoned his personal assistant, Sarah Matthews, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm, maternal demeanor. Within minutes, she had everything arranged: a bath in the executive facilities of the building, new clothes hurriedly purchased from a nearby store, and a lunch that made Tommy's stomach growl at the mere sight of it. "Do you have any documents, Tommy?" Walker asked during lunch, watching the boy try to maintain polite manners while hungrily devouring a sandwich. Tommy swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the plate. I had a birth certificate once. But I lost everything when..." His voice faltered. Losing his mother had also meant losing the small apartment they'd lived in, along with all their belongings. "Sarah will help you with that," Walker assured him. "We'll need to get your situation sorted. In the meantime, you'll stay in one of the apartments the company keeps for visiting executives. Sarah will oversee everything." The apartment was larger than anywhere Tommy had ever lived. A bedroom, living room, kitchen, and bathroom, all impeccably clean and fully furnished. For someone used to sleeping in alleyways, it felt like a palace. "Tomorrow we'll start with your paperwork," Sarah explained as she showed Tommy how the appliances worked. "And we'll also get you enrolled in school." Mr. Walker was firm about that. Education is non-negotiable. School. The word sent a chill through Tommy's stomach. It had been 2 years since he had set foot in a classroom. Could he keep up? Would the other kids notice he was different? The following days were a roller coaster of emotions and new experiences. Sarah turned out to be a patient mentor, teaching him everything from basic etiquette to how to use a computer. Tommy soaked it all up eagerly, his young mind making up for the years he had lost on the streets. At the office he started with simple tasks: organizing files, delivering interdepartmental mail, helping out in the break room. At first, the staff was wary of the boss's new protege, but they were gradually won over by his dedication and polite demeanor. Walker observed from a distance, stepping in only when necessary. Something about the boy intrigued him deeply. Maybe it was the way Tommy faced every challenge with quiet determination, or the way his eyes lit up whenever he learned something new. One afternoon, as Tommy was organizing a stack of documents, Walker called him into his office. "How are you settling in?" "Good, sir," Tommy replied, still not entirely comfortable with casual conversations. "Sarah has been a huge help." "And school?" Tommy hesitated. School was his biggest challenge. Despite being placed in a special recovery class, the gap between him and the other students felt like an insurmountable chasm. It's hard," he admitted at last. "There's so much I missed in those 2 years." Walker stood and walked over to the window, a habit Tommy had noticed whenever the man was deep in thought. "You know, Tommy, when I was your age, I had my own struggles in school. Not because I lived on the streets, but because I had dyslexia. Back then, people didn't understand it well. They thought I was lazy or stupid." Tommy looked at him, surprised. It was hard to imagine this imposing man as a child who had struggled. "Do you know what saved me?" Walker continued. "My father. The same man who wore this watch." He touched the object on his wrist. "He would sit with me every night, no matter how tired he was from work. He helped me with my homework, made up games to help me learn, and never gave up on me." Turning to Tommy, his eyes held a different kind of brightness. "What do you say we try something similar? I can arrange for a private tutor in the afternoons after work. And on weekends maybe we can go over what you're learning together." The offer caught Tommy off guard. Why would someone so important dedicate his free time to a street kid? The answer came in the form of a memory. His mother, even after long hours of grueling work, always finding the energy to read with him before bed. I'd really like that, sir. Good, Walker said with a smile. And Tommy? You can call me Alex when we're outside the office. That night, lying in his new bed, Tommy thought about how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. From the streets to an apartment, from abandonment to a second chance. But more than the material comfort, it was the feeling of someone caring about his future that warmed his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. What he didn't know was that, across the city in his solitary penthouse, Alexander Walker was also reflecting on the changes in his life. His father's watch felt heavy on his wrist, as if reminding him of a long-forgotten promise. A promise to make a difference in someone's life, just as his father had done for him. Sarah watched the growing bond between Walker and Tommy with a mix of approval and concern. In her 20 years of working with Walker, she had never seen him take such a personal interest in anyone. It was as if the boy had awakened something dormant in the businessman's heart. Yet, she also understood how ruthless the corporate world could be, and she knew many would question the motives behind this sudden benevolence. Meanwhile, on the streets that had once been his home, other boys continued their daily fight for survival. Sometimes Tommy saw them from the office window and his heart ached. Survivor's guilt gnawed at him during these moments. Why was he given this chance and not them? The answer, he realized, was still unfolding in the new path his life was taking. 3 months had passed since Tommy's life took a dramatic turn. Winter had arrived in full force, and from the warmth of his comfortable room, he watched snowflakes fall softly outside the window. It was hard to believe that not long ago, he had been struggling to survive in that very same cold. His grades at school were steadily improving, thanks to private tutoring and weekend study sessions with Walker. The businessman proved to be a patient teacher, turning math problems into games and history lessons into fascinating stories. Tommy discovered he had a sharp mind, it had just needed guidance to bloom. That Monday morning, Tommy arrived early at the office, as was now his routine. He was sorting through the mail when raised voices from Walker's office caught his attention. The door was slightly ajar, and despite himself, fragments of the conversation reached his ears. "Have you lost your mind, Alex?" It was the voice of Richard Bennett, one of the company's senior directors. "First, you bring a street kid into the office, and now this? The board won't stand for it." "The board doesn't have to stand for anything, Richard." Walker's voice was controlled, but the tension was palpable. "This is my personal decision." The tension in the room was palpable even through the slightly ajar door. Tommy could hear the creaking of the leather chair, probably Bennett shifting restlessly as he spoke. "Folks, nothing involving the CEO of Walker Industries is personal. Have you thought about what the press is going to say? Powerful businessman adopts street boy. The Sharks will have a field day." Tommy felt his heart stop. Adoption. Walker was thinking of adopting him? "Do you have any idea what kind of risk you're taking?" Bennett continued. "It's not just the company's image on the line. It's your personal reputation, Alex. Everything your father built." The mention of Walker's father made Tommy shrink back. He knew how sensitive that subject was for his mentor. "My father," Walker responded in a controlled voice, "taught me that a man's true worth isn't in what he owns, but in what he does for others." "Tommy isn't a charity project, Richard. He's a risky investment?" Bennett interrupted with sarcasm. "Come on, Alex. I've seen this before. Lonely executives trying to buy a family. It never ends well. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Then tell me, have you checked his background? Do you know where he's been for the last 2 years? Who he hung out with? What he did to survive?" The silence that followed weighed on Tommy's heart like lead. Memories he had tried to bury began to surface. Cold nights when the desperation for food was so great that any means seemed justifiable. The missions Cobra forced him into, using his innocent appearance to create distractions while other gang members acted. "Sarah did all the necessary checks," Walker finally replied. Bennett let out a humorless laugh. "Sarah? Your assistant has too soft a heart when it comes to kids, you know that. And even if she did a superficial search, how much of a street boy's past shows up in official records?" Tommy felt his legs give way. Bennett was right. Sarah had asked questions about his past, of course, but he always steered the conversation away or gave vague answers. And she, with her compassionate nature, never pressed too hard. Tommy didn't wait to hear the rest. His heart racing out of control, he ran to the nearest bathroom and locked himself in a stall. His entire world seemed to spin. Adoption. The word echoed in his mind like a bell. But Bennett was right. No one really knew about his past. Not even Walker. How could he tell them about the things he had to do to survive on the streets? About the times he had to steal, not just food but wallets from distracted people? About Cobra's gang who had protected him in exchange for small favors? The memory of Cobra made his blood run cold. Marcus Cobra Williams controlled much of the territory where Tommy used to stay. He was known for never forgetting a debt or a deserter. Tommy looked at his trembling hands. His nails, once always dirty and broken, were now clean and well kept. His new clothes smelled like fabric softener. His reflection in the mirror showed a fuller, healthier face. He was living a dream, but what if that dream was built on lies? The decision he made in that moment would change his life forever. With tears in his eyes, he wrote a quick note. "I'm sorry, Mr. Walker. Mr. Bennett is right. I don't deserve this. Thank you for everything." He left the note on Sarah's desk and walked out of the building without looking back. The biting cold hit him like a slap, but he kept walking. His legs carried him automatically to the old territories he knew so well. As he walked through the familiar streets of his old territory, every step felt heavier than the last. The contrast between his current life and the past had never been so clear. Stores he used to only see through the windows now had their familiar price tags, some items costing less than one of his new shoes. The distinctive smell of the alleyways, a mix of garbage, urine, and despair, hit his nostrils like a slap. How had he ever gotten used to this before? How had he survived here? The answer came in the form of a hoarse voice that still haunted his nightmares. Well, Cobra emerged from the shadows like a specter from his past. He hadn't changed a bit. The same worn leather jacket, the same gold tooth gleaming threateningly, the same calculating gaze that seemed to strip the soul from its victims. Tommy noticed details that had once gone unnoticed. The poorly done tattoos on Cobra's fingers, probably from prison. The slight tremor in his hands, a sign of withdrawal from some drug. The way his eyes constantly scanned the area, like an animal always on alert. "Tommy, Tommy," Cobra hummed, circling the boy like a predator. "You've grown. You're stronger. More presentable." He tugged at the sleeve of Tommy's new jacket, evaluating the fabric. "Expensive clothes. Nice life, huh?" "It's not what you're thinking," Tommy tried to argue, his voice betraying his nervousness. "No?" Cobra raised an eyebrow. "Then tell me, what am I thinking?" He moved closer, his breath, a mix of cheap cigarette and stale coffee, making Tommy instinctively pull back. "I'm thinking you've forgotten who protected you when you had nothing. Who taught you to survive on these streets?" The two other men who approached were new to the group. Tommy didn't recognize them. That worried him even more. With the old gang members, at least he knew what to expect. These guys were unpredictable. "The boss has been very patient with you, kid," one of them said, snapping his fingers. Others who ran didn't get so lucky. Tommy knew exactly what he was talking about. He remembered Mike, a boy just a few years older than him who had tried to leave the gang. His body was found 3 days later near the train tracks. "I didn't run," Tommy tried to argue. I just got a better job." "Oh yes," Cobra smiled, that smile that never reached his eyes. "At Walker Industries. You know, it's funny you mention that. Because just yesterday I was talking to some friends who are very interested in, how can I put it, insider information." Tommy's stomach twisted. He knew where this was headed. "There are people willing to pay a lot for corporate secrets," Cobra continued. "Especially from a company like Walker Industries. And you, my young friend, have free access to the building, don't you?" "I just organize files," Tommy weakly protested. "I don't have access to anything important." "But you have access to the building," Cobra insisted. "You know the routines, the schedules, the security systems. And more importantly," he paused dramatically, "you have the trust of the great Alexander Walker." The mention of Walker's name made something stir inside Tommy. A rage he didn't know he had started to bubble up. "No," he said, his voice more firm. "I won't betray his trust." Cobra laughed, but his eyes remained as cold as ice. "How touching. The street kid found a surrogate father." He moved closer again, all pretense of kindness vanishing from his face. "But you forget one important detail, Tommy. You don't have a choice." That's when Tommy saw the metallic gleam in one of the thug's hands. A knife. His heart raced. "It'd be a shame," Cobra continued, "if the police found out about your little jobs for me. Or even better, if Mr. Walker knew exactly how his protege survived on the streets." The world seemed to be closing in around Tommy. The alley suddenly felt smaller, more suffocating. The walls of the buildings cast shadows that seemed to want to swallow him whole. What he didn't notice in his moment of panic was the black car parked discreetly around the corner. Nor did he see Sarah Matthews with her phone pressed to her ear, watching the entire scene with a mix of concern and determination. "I found him, Mr. Walker," she whispered into the phone. "But the situation is worse than we imagined. Much worse." The grip on Tommy's arm tightened as Cobra dragged him further into the alley. The two thugs followed closely, their shadows projected onto the dirty walls like threatening specters. The smell of mildew and trash was suffocating, but not nearly as much as the panic beginning to take over the boy. "Listen well, Tommy," Cobra spoke with a false sweetness in his voice. "You've got until tomorrow to figure out how you're going to help us. But to make sure you understand the seriousness of the situation." He gestured to one of the men who stepped forward, snapping his fingers. Tommy squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. But the blow never came. Instead, he heard the screech of tires on asphalt and authoritative voices filling the alley. "Police! Freeze!" The reaction was immediate. Cobra shoved Tommy against the wall and tried to run, but it was too late. The alley was surrounded on both ends. Patrol cars blocked the exits, and armed officers moved in with military precision. Among them, to Tommy's complete shock, was Walker. His normally composed face was tense with worry, and something more. Anger, perhaps? The businessman moved through the alley without hesitation, ignoring the officers' protests about his safety. "Step away from the boy," Walker ordered, his voice carrying an authority Tommy had never heard before. Cobra, cornered but still holding on to his characteristic arrogance, let out a harsh laugh. "Well, if it isn't the great Alexander Walker himself. Came to collect your charity project?" "Actually," a female voice sounded behind Walker, "we came to arrest a wanted criminal." Sarah emerged from the shadows, but this wasn't the Sarah Tommy knew. This Sarah had a police badge hanging around her neck and an entirely different demeanor. "Marcus Cobra Williams, you're under arrest for extortion, child exploitation, and several other crimes we've been investigating for months." Tommy's world spun. Sarah was a cop? All this time? The next events unfolded like a movie. Cobra and his thugs were handcuffed and taken away. Officers were collecting evidence from the alley, photographing and cataloging everything. Tommy remained pressed against the wall, his legs barely able to hold him up. Walker slowly approached, as if afraid to startle a wounded animal. "Tommy," he called softly, "are you all right?" The simple question was too much. The tears Tommy had tried to hold back began to fall freely. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm sorry for everything. Mr. Bennett was right. I don't deserve your trust. I lied, I know," Walker gently interrupted. "I always knew." Tommy looked at him, confused. "How?" "Sarah isn't just my assistant," Walker explained, gesturing toward the woman now coordinating the police operation. "She's a detective in the Child Protection Division. We've been working together for years, identifying and helping at-risk children." Sarah stepped forward, her badge now tucked away, returning to the Sarah Tommy knew. "When you returned the watch," she explained, "Alex called me. He wanted to help you, but we needed to make sure it was safe. I started investigating your past and found your connection to Cobra's gang. But instead of pushing you away," Walker continued, "we decided it was even more important to help you. Sarah kept watch to ensure your safety, while he paused, choosing his words carefully, "while I did what my father would have done. Give someone a chance who deserved it." Tommy shook his head, still processing everything. "But the things I did, they were to survive," Walker firmly completed. "Tommy, look at me. You were an abandoned child, manipulated by criminals. But at the first chance to do the right thing, when you found my watch, you chose honesty. That says more about your character than any mistake in the past." Sarah gently placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "You're not the first boy Cobra manipulated, and sadly you won't be the last. But thanks to you we finally got him. His threats were recorded, and along with other testimonies, it'll be enough to keep him locked away for a long time." A police officer approached, needing Tommy's statement. Walker nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead. I'll be here when you're done." In the next 2 hours Tommy told everything. Every little crime, every moment of desperation, every time Cobra had forced him to take part in his schemes. It was painful but also cathartic. It was like draining an old wound that had never properly healed. When he was finally finished, he was physically and emotionally drained. Walker, who had stayed close throughout the process, led him to his car. "As for what you heard earlier," Walker began as he drove, "about adoption." "You don't have to explain," Tommy quickly interrupted. "I understand that after all this," Walker continued firmly, "I'm even more certain of my decision. If you want to, of course." Tommy looked at him, surprised. Even knowing everything? Walker stopped the car in front of a small cafe they used to frequent on weekends. Tommy, family isn't about being perfect. It's about accepting each other, flaws and scars and all. My father taught me that, and now it's my turn to pass that lesson on. They entered the cafe in silence. It was a cozy place, with soft jazz music playing in the background and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee in the air. They sat at their usual table by the window. I know this is an important decision, Walker continued after they placed their orders. You don't have to answer now. But I want you to know that no matter what you choose, you're not alone anymore. Tommy watched the snow falling outside, thinking about how much his life had changed in the past few months. From the streets to an apartment, from loneliness to a family? The word still felt strange, almost frightening in its magnitude. Mr. Bennett? He began hesitantly. Richard Bennett is an excellent financial director, Walker interrupted with a smile, but he doesn't decide my personal life. Besides, his smile widened. Sarah has some interesting stories about his youth that made him surprisingly understanding after a little chat. Tommy couldn't help but smile a little, imagining Sarah using her investigative skills to talk to Bennett. But soon his face grew serious again. What if I'm not a good son? Walker placed his coffee cup on the table, looking Tommy in the eyes. And what if I'm not a good father? Tommy, no one is born knowing how to be family. It's something we learn together day by day. All we need is to be willing to try. The waitress brought Tommy's hot chocolate, extra marshmallows just the way he liked it. The warmth of the drink in his hands was comforting, familiar. Like so many other little things that Walker had introduced into his life. Regular dinners, clean clothes, conversations about the day, help with homework. Can I think for a bit? Tommy finally asked. Take all the time you need, Walker replied with a kind smile. There's no rush. But as he watched the snow falling outside, Tommy already knew his answer. He was just beginning to understand that sometimes the best families aren't the ones we're born into, but the ones we choose, and that choose us back. A week had passed since the incident with Cobra. The routine at Walker Industries had returned to normal, or almost. Tommy still noticed the curious glances from the employees when he walked through the hallways. Some were sympathetic, others filled with suspicion, but most just seemed intrigued by the boy who had captured the attention of their powerful boss. Bennett, surprisingly, had become one of his biggest supporters. The conversation with Sarah seemed to have struck something deep within the financial director. Tommy had caught him several times watching him with a distant, almost nostalgic look, as if seeing in him the reflection of some old memory. That Friday morning, Tommy was organizing some files when he heard a commotion in the main hallway. A well-dressed woman, with perfectly styled gray hair and an upright posture, was walking purposefully toward Walker's office. Her high heels clicked on the marble floor like an unrelenting metronome. "Excuse me," she said to the secretary, her voice carrying a slight European accent. "I need to see my son immediately." Tommy's heart tightened. Eleanor Walker, the matriarch of the Walker family, rarely visited the office. And when she did, it was usually not for happy reasons. "Alexander." Her voice cut through the closed door. "What is this I'm hearing about you wanting to adopt a street boy?" Tommy's blood ran cold. Through the slightly ajar door, he could see Walker getting up to greet his mother. "Mom," he began, "I didn't expect you today." "Obviously," she replied, sitting down uninvited. "I had to hear from others that my only son decided to do something so impulsive." "It's not impulsive," Walker answered with a calmness that Tommy admired. "I've been thinking about this for months." "Months?" Eleanor laughed without humor. "Alex dear, you barely know this boy. Have you thought about the risks? The exposure to the family? Your father." "Dad would have understood," Walker interrupted firmly. "Your father built an empire." Eleanor raised her voice. "He dedicated his life to creating a legacy for you, for our family. And now you want to hand it all over to a complete stranger?" Tommy felt his hands trembling. He wanted to run, to hide, to disappear. But something kept him rooted to the floor, listening. "Tommy isn't a stranger," Walker replied. "He's a bright boy who had far fewer opportunities than most. Exactly the kind of person Dad always wanted to help." Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, a gesture Tommy had seen Walker make so many times. "Do you remember Charles?" The silence that followed was heavy. Walker seemed to lose his composure momentarily. "His brother has nothing to do with this," he finally replied, his voice tight. "No?" Eleanor turned to face him. "Your father also saw something special in that boy. He wanted to give someone less fortunate a chance. And how did it end? With him stealing half the family's savings and disappearing." Tommy felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. There had been a brother? An adopted brother who had betrayed the family? Charles was different, Walker insisted. He was older, had a history of problems. And this boy doesn't? Eleanor cut in. Do you really know everything about his past? I know enough, Walker replied firmly. I know that when he found Dad's watch, he could have sold it for a small fortune. Instead, he searched for its owner. I know that when he had the chance to betray my trust for personal gain, he chose to do the right thing even under threat. Eleanor sighed, her posture softening slightly. Alex, darling, I understand that you felt alone since Clara passed away. But there are other ways. It's not about loneliness, Mom, Walker gently interrupted. It's about making a difference in someone's life. Like Dad did in mine when he helped me with my dyslexia, instead of giving up on me like all the teachers suggested. Tommy didn't realize he was crying until he felt a gentle hand on his shoulder. It was Sarah. Come on, she whispered, guiding him away from the door. Let them talk. In the small cafe downstairs, Sarah ordered hot chocolate for Tommy, extra marshmallows just like always. For a few minutes they sat in silence. I didn't know, Tommy finally said. About his brother, Charles? Sarah nodded thoughtfully. It was a long time ago. Alex was still a teenager. Charles was 18 when the Walkers took him in, a charismatic young man who genuinely seemed to want to turn his life around. For 2 years, everything seemed perfect. What happened? He earned the family's trust, learned about the business, and then one night, he emptied the accounts he had access to. He was never seen again. Sarah paused. It was a devastating blow to the family, especially to Mr. Walker Sr. He never forgave himself for being deceived. Tommy stirred his hot chocolate, deep in thought. Is that why Mrs. Walker doesn't trust me? Eleanor is a complicated woman, Sarah explained. She lost her husband 5 years ago, almost lost her son to depression when Clara died. She's just trying to protect what's left of her family. Maybe? Tommy hesitated. Maybe it's better if I leave. Is that what you want? No, Tommy admitted softly. But I don't want to cause trouble for Mr. Walker. He's done so much for me. Tommy, Sarah leaned in over the table, can I tell you a secret? In all the years I've worked with Alex, I've never seen him as alive as he has been in the last few months. You've brought something back to him, something he lost when Clara died. The private elevator chimed and Eleanor Walker emerged into the lobby. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Tommy. For a moment, grandmother and potential grandson stared at each other across the space. Then, something unexpected happened. Eleanor walked over to his table. So, she said, her voice still formal but less cold, you're the famous Tommy. Yes, ma'am, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. That watch, she finally said, was very important to my husband. He wore it every day of our life together. She paused. Why did you return it? Tommy thought for a moment before answering. Because some things are worth more than money. When I saw the engraving, I realized it wasn't just an expensive watch. It was a family story. Something shifted subtly in Eleanor's gaze. And now, what do you want from our family? Tommy swallowed hard, gathering his courage. I just want a chance to belong somewhere. To make a difference like Mr. Walker does. To have a real family. Eleanor nodded slowly as if confirming something to herself. My husband used to say that a person's true character is revealed not in the big decisions, but in the small daily choices. She stood up. Keep making the right choices, Tommy. Our family has room for more good memories. With that, she left, leaving behind a faint trace of expensive perfume and the feeling that something fundamental had changed. Tommy looked at Sarah, who was smiling. Well, she said, I think you just passed the hardest test of all. Upstairs in Walker's office, the phone rang. It was Eleanor. Son, she said, her voice softer than before, maybe you're right about the boy. He reminded me of your father today. Walker smiled, looking out the window at the city his father had helped build. I know, Mom. I know. The adoption hearing was scheduled for 3 days from now. Tommy watched the calendar in his room, where he had circled the date in red. He should have been excited, maybe anxious, but an inexplicable weight grew in his chest. Eleanor Walker's words about Charles still echoed in his mind. On that Wednesday morning, the Walker Industries office buzzed with an unusual energy. Tommy noticed the tense glances from the employees, the whispers in the hallways. Something was wrong. Mr. Walker is in the conference room, Sarah informed him as he arrived, her usually calm face showing concern. There's been a development. Through the glass walls, Tommy could see Walker surrounded by executives, all bent-over documents spread across the table. Bennett was gesturing emphatically, his face red with agitation. It was then that he saw the newspaper on Sarah's desk. The headline made his blood run cold. Walker Empire under threat. Documents reveal possible fraud. It's a lie, Sarah quickly said, noticing his gaze. Someone's trying to manipulate old information to harm the company. Tommy took the newspaper with trembling hands. The article suggested that Walker Industries had been involved in irregular business dealings years ago, during Walker's father's management. Leaked documents apparently showed suspicious transactions and questionable contracts. But who would do this? Tommy asked, though something in his gut already knew the answer. As if answering his question, the private elevator doors opened. A tall man, about 40 years old, stepped out with the confidence of someone who knew the place well. His smile was disturbingly familiar. "Charles," Sarah whispered, her body instantly tense. The man stopped in front of them, adjusting his expensive suit. "Sarah," he greeted with feigned cordiality. "It's been a while. And this must be the famous Tommy. The new Walker charity project." Tommy felt his face flush, but before he could respond, Walker appeared. "What are you doing here, Charles?" "Well, little brother," Charles smiled, that same smile that never reached his eyes, "can't I visit the family business?" "You lost the right to call it the family business a long time ago," Walker replied, his voice controlled but loaded with tension. "Just like you lost the right to call me brother." Charles feigned a hurt look. Such hostility. "And here I am, bringing a friendly warning." He pulled an envelope from his pocket. "I have more documents. A lot more. Unless, of course, we can reach an agreement." "Blackmail? That's low even for you, Charles." "Blackmail is such an ugly word," Charles smiled. "I prefer to call it family negotiation. After all, you all seem very eager to expand the family lately." His gaze shifted to Tommy. "Although I think the press would love to know about your nude son, especially his connections to a certain gang." Tommy felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. How did Charles know about Cobra? "What are you talking about?" Walker stepped forward, protective. "Oh, you didn't tell him everything, did you, Tommy?" Charles laughed. "About the special missions you did for Cobra? How you helped steal information from other companies?" I never." Tommy stammered, but the memories suffocated him. There was one time, just once, when Cobra had forced him into an office pretending to look for his parents. He had distracted the receptionist while other gang members. No, he didn't want to remember. "Leave the boy alone," Walker ordered. "Your problem is with me." "On the contrary," Charles replied smoothly. "My problem has always been with this family and its hypocrisy. You judged me, you kicked me out, but now you're ready to embrace another street kid? One with a much worse history than mine?" Bennett appeared at the conference room door. "Alex, we need you here. The lawyers are on the line." Walker hesitated, torn between the company crisis and the need to protect Tommy. "Go," Tommy said quietly. "I'm fine." As soon as Walker stepped away, Charles leaned in toward Tommy. "You know, kid, you remind me of myself 20 years ago. Same hopeful look, same illusion that you could really be part of this family." "I'm not like you," Tommy replied, finding strength in his voice. "Not?" Charles raised an eyebrow. "Then why don't you tell Alex about that time at the Meridian Corporation office? About the files Cobra stole while you distracted security?" Tommy paled. "How did he know about that?" "Oh yes," Charles continued, savoring the moment. "Cobra and I have been talking quite a bit lately. Interesting how people share information when money is involved." It was then that Tommy understood. "It was you. You hired Cobra to pressure me?" Charles clapped softly. "Very good. Maybe you're smarter than I thought. Yes, I needed a way back in, to prove that this family isn't as perfect as it thinks. And you, my young friend, are the perfect piece." "Why?" Tommy asked, his voice trembling. "Why do this?" "Because," Charles stepped closer, his voice just a whisper, "sometimes you have to destroy something to rebuild it. Walker Industries needs a lesson in humility. And you, Tommy, are going to help me teach it?" "No," Tommy took a step back. "I'm not going to help you hurt them." "Oh, but you already have," Charles smiled. "Your mere presence here has already created all the cracks I needed. Now, it's just a matter of time before everything falls apart." Tommy looked through the glass walls at Walker, who was gesturing nervously on the phone. The entire empire his father had built was at risk. And why? Because he had opened his heart to a street kid? It was then that Tommy made the hardest decision of his life. "Mr. Bennett," he called, stepping into the conference room. "Do you have a minute?" The next hour was the most painful of Tommy's life. He told everything every little detail of his involvement with Cobra, including the incident at Meridian Corporation. Bennett took notes furiously, occasionally asking questions to clarify specific points. Walker just listened, his face an unreadable mask. When Tommy finished, the silence in the room was deafening. "This," Bennett finally said, "could be exactly what we needed." Walker looked at his CFO, confused. "What do you mean?" "If what Tommy is saying is true, then we have proof that Charles was connected to Cobra even before Tommy came into our lives. This changes everything." Bennett was already dialing his phone. "Sarah, I need you to contact your colleagues in the police. I think we've just figured out who's been behind a series of corporate leaks over the past few years." Charles, who had been watching from the hallway, lost his smile for the first time. When two police officers stepped off the elevator led by Sarah, he tried to run. He didn't get far. Later that night, Tommy sat in Walker's office, waiting for the verdict that would surely change his life. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Walker asked softly. "I was scared," Tommy admitted. "Scared of losing all of this." "Losing you?" Walker sighed, sitting down beside the boy. "You know what impresses me the most? It wasn't that you told the truth today. It was that you resisted Charles's blackmail, even knowing it could cost you your chance at having a family." "I already have a family," Tommy replied softly. "Even if it's just for a few more days." Walker looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Well, after all this, the adoption hearing." "Tommy," Walker interrupted, "you've just proven that you're more a part of this family than Charles has ever been. You chose the truth even when it hurt. You chose to protect the people you love, even if it meant risking your own well-being." He smiled. "If that's not being a Walker, I don't know what is." Tommy felt tears begin to fall. "Even after everything I've done?" "Especially after everything you've done," Walker replied, pulling him into a hug. "Because you did the right thing when it mattered." Outside the office, Eleanor Walker watched the scene with tears in her eyes. Maybe she thought her husband was right after all. Sometimes the greatest blessings come in the most unexpected packages. The day of the adoption hearing dawned clear and cold. The snow that had fallen overnight covered the city with a pristine white blanket, as if nature itself wanted to mark the moment with a new beginning. Tommy adjusted his tie for the 10th time in front of the mirror. Walker had insisted on buying him a new suit for the occasion, despite the boy's protest that his regular clothes would be fine. "Some occasions," he had said with a smile, "deserve something special." The courtroom was surprisingly full for an adoption hearing. Sarah was there, of course, along with Bennett and several employees from Walker Industries. But the biggest surprise was the presence of Eleanor Walker, sitting in the front row, impeccably dressed in her navy blue suit. While they waited for the judge, Tommy couldn't stop thinking about how much his life had changed in the past few months. From the cold streets to a family. From desperation to hope. From loneliness to belonging. "Nervous?" Walker asked quietly, noticing how the boy fidgeted in his seat. "A little," Tommy admitted. "What if?" "No what ifs," Walker gently interrupted. "We're here because this is what we both want." Judge Wilson entered the room and everyone stood. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes behind thin-framed glasses. He examined the documents in front of him before looking at Tommy and Walker. "Well," he began, "I have quite an interesting case here. It's not every day we see the CEO of one of the city's largest companies wanting to adopt a boy who lived on the streets." He paused. "In fact, considering the recent widely reported events, some might question the timing of this adoption." Tommy felt his heart tighten. The newspapers had made a spectacle of Charles's arrest and his connections to Cobra. Though Walker Industries had come out unscathed, actually strengthened by how they handled the situation, there was still a lot of media buzz. "However," the judge continued, "I also have several testimonies here. Detective Sarah Matthews, speaking about Tommy's character and integrity in difficult situations. Mr. Richard Bennett, highlighting how the boy chose the truth even when it could cost him his future. And, particularly interesting, a very eloquent testimony from Mrs. Eleanor Walker." Tommy looked up, surprised at Eleanor, who kept her elegant posture, though her eyes were teary. "Tommy," the judge addressed him directly, "would you like to say anything before I make my decision?" Tommy swallowed hard and stood up. He had rehearsed a speech, but at that moment, all the prepared words seemed inadequate. He began, his voice trembling slightly. "For a long time I thought I didn't deserve a family. That my past, my choices, define me forever." He paused, gathering his courage. "But Mr. Walker, Alex, showed me that it's not our mistakes that define us, but how we choose to move forward after them." He looked at Walker, who smiled encouragingly. When I returned that watch, I wasn't thinking about rewards or changing my life. I just knew it was the right thing to do. And Alex did the same for me. He gave me a chance not because he expected something in return, but because it was the right thing. Tommy turned to Eleanor. You asked me once why I returned the watch. You said it was because some things are worth more than money. Now I understand better what you meant. Family is worth more than anything. When he finished, there were few dry eyes in the room. Even Bennett discreetly wiped away a tear. Judge Wilson smiled. Well, I think that simplifies my decision quite a bit. He picked up his gavel. It is with great pleasure that I approve this adoption. From today on, you are officially Thomas James Walker. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, but Tommy barely heard it over the applause and congratulations. All he could feel were Walker's, no, his father's, arms around him. Welcome to the family, son, Walker whispered. Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes shining in a way Tommy had never seen before. Your grandfather, she said softly, would have adored you. Then, to everyone's surprise, including her own, she pulled her grandson into a hug. The celebration continued at Tommy's favorite restaurant, the same cafe where he and Walker had had so many important conversations. Sarah had decorated a special table with balloons and a banner that read, Welcome, Thomas Walker. You know, Bennett commented, sitting down next to Tommy with a piece of cake, when you showed up that first day with the watch, I thought Alex had lost his mind. I've never been so happy to be wrong. Sarah raised her glass in a toast. To the Walker family, who never stops growing and surprising us. Later, at home, and how good it felt to truly call that place home, Tommy found a package on his bed. Inside was a watch, not as old as Walker's but just as elegant. It was my father's, Walker explained from the doorway. He gave it to me when I was 12. Now it's yours. Tommy turned the watch over and saw a new engraving, to Thomas Walker, may time always be our ally. With love, Dad. But this is a family watch, Tommy protested. Walker smiled. Exactly. And your family? That night, Tommy stood by his bedroom window for a long time, gazing out at the city. Somewhere down there, other boys like him were still struggling to survive. Maybe he thought one day he could do for them what Walker had done for him. After all, now he knew, sometimes all someone needs is a chance to prove their true worth. The watch on his wrist glowed softly in the dark, marking not just the hours, but the beginning of a new life. A life where he was no longer the street boy but Thomas Walker, son, grandson, and living proof that love can truly change lives. Dear viewers, this has been the heartfelt story of Tommy and his journey from the streets to finding a real family. If this story moved you as much as it did us, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. Your comments mean a lot to us. Let us know what you thought of this story of overcoming and transformation. Also, share if you want to hear more intense stories like this. Your support helps us keep bringing these inspiring tales to you. See you next time.